when my son leaned across the table with a soft smile and said he had a surprise for me. I thought it would be the kind of surprise that fills a father's heart with pride and warmth. Instead, he slid a plain envelope toward me as if it contained nothing more than a birthday card. I opened it with trembling hands only to see figures that made my stomach twist and my chest lock up. $500,000 in debt. My name scrawled at the bottom of the papers. My blood went cold as my son stared at me with an expression that was both nervous and expectant. I wanted to ask him why. I wanted to shout, but my throat closed, and all I could hear was the sound of my pulse thundering in my ears. A father should never look at his child and wonder if everything he sacrificed was just for this moment of betrayal. Don't miss powerful stories like this one. Tap that subscribe button now and be part of every twist to come. I forced my voice to stay calm even though my insides were burning. I asked him what this was and why my name was on it. He leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his drink, and said it was just a temporary fix. He told me he needed me to sign. He said it would all be worth it, because in a few years he would be on top of the world, and I would be proud to know I helped him get there. He spoke like this was an investment in his future, as though $500,000 was nothing but a stepping stone. My heart ached as I listened. I remembered his first steps, his laughter as a child, the way he clung to me when storms frightened him. And now he sat across from me as a grown man, treating me like a bank account he could drain without consequence. I looked at the numbers again. $500,000. Debt tied to risky ventures I knew nothing about. He had already placed my name as a guarantor. I wasn't being asked. I was being cornered. My signature was the last piece of the trap. I clenched my fists under the table, nails digging into my palms, trying to stop the rage from spilling out in front of him. I wanted to protect him from the world, but I never imagined I'd have to protect myself from him. He smiled like he was offering me a gift, as though I should thank him for allowing me to shoulder the weight of his reckless choices. My mind reeled back to all the nights I stayed up late working overtime just to put him through school. I thought of the clothes I wore until they tore so he could have new ones. I thought of the dreams I gave up so his could live. Now he was gambling away not just his future but mine, and he expected me to go along with it quietly. I asked him if he understood what he was doing to me. He shrugged and said I was being dramatic. He told me I had lived enough of my life already, and that it was time for me to step up for him. The way he said it cut deeper than any insult ever could, as if my years meant nothing, as if my sacrifices were invisible. My chest tightened as I realized he didn't see me as his father anymore. He saw me as leverage. I put the papers down slowly. My hands shook, but my eyes stayed locked on his. I told him I needed time to think. He smirked like he had already won. He leaned in and whispered that the deal was time-sensitive, that I had no choice, that if I loved him I would sign without hesitation. Love. He used that word like a weapon, like a rope to bind me tighter. My throat ached, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the envelope burning in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his smile, that smug certainty that I would fold. Memories of his childhood clashed with the reality of his betrayal. I wanted to believe this wasn't who he truly was, that maybe desperation had twisted him. But the truth gnawed at me. He had planned this. He had chosen me because he knew I wouldn't turn my back on him. He thought my love was blind. The next morning, I stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Weary lines carved by years of sacrifice and worry. I thought of the life I had built, the home I had secured, the peace I had tried to hold on to in my later years. Was I supposed to throw all of it away because he couldn't handle his own responsibilities? No. Something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to let him destroy me. Not after everything I had endured just to stand this far. But I also knew revenge, if taken too quickly, would only make me look bitter. I had to be patient. I had to let him believe he had won. I had to play the role of the father he thought was weak, while quietly setting the stage for his downfall. My heart hurt, but my resolve grew sharper with every breath. He wanted me to sign. I would sign nothing. Instead, I would sign the beginning of his lesson. I folded the papers back into the envelope and kept them hidden in my desk. I went about the next few days as if nothing had happened, speaking to him with warmth, asking about his life, his dreams, his plans. He grew bolder, more arrogant, believing I was preparing to yield. What he didn't know was that I was gathering information, tracing the path of his lies, uncovering the fragile empire he was trying to build on my back. Each thread I pulled revealed more deceit, more recklessness, more strangers who had already been burned by his ambition. My pain began to shift into something else. A fire, a plan, a hunger to turn his arrogance into ashes he would have to choke on. I didn't raise him to betray me, but if he chose that path, then I would be the one to remind him that even the strongest walls can crumble when they're built on lies. And so I waited. I listened. I let him believe he was in control. All the while, I was building a revenge that would not just protect me, but show him the true weight of the debt he tried to place on my shoulders. He thought he could bury me under numbers, but he had no idea I was already digging his grave with every detail I uncovered. I sat with the envelope still heavy in my lap even after he had walked away to take a call. My fingers trembled as if the paper itself carried the weight of chains. $500,000 of debt was suddenly tied to my name, and yet my son's voice on the phone in the hallway sounded calm and almost cheerful. That contrast gnawed at my gut. I remembered his childhood. I remembered the boy who used to run across the yard, shouting that one day he would take care of me. And now I sat in silence, blindsided, with the taste of betrayal like iron on my tongue. The waiter asked if everything was all right. I forced a nod, but my throat was too tight to form words. My son returned, sliding back into his chair as if nothing had happened. He smiled at me, a smile that felt rehearsed. I wanted to confront him right then, but something inside me told me not to. Not yet. Instead, I asked him softly if he knew what was in the envelope. He met my eyes only for a second before looking away, taking a sip of his drink, and saying it was complicated. Complicated. That word sank into me like a dull blade. As the night went on, his words flowed easily, but each sentence carried shadows. He spoke of opportunities gone wrong, of investments that had collapsed, of partners who had left him stranded. But what he never explained was why he had chosen me, his own father, to carry the burden of his downfall. Each story twisted further, and I felt like I was sitting across from a stranger who had borrowed my son's face. When I pressed again, his tone shifted. He leaned forward and told me I would understand one day. He said that if I truly loved him, I would stand with him, even if it meant carrying the weight of his mistakes. That sentence shattered something inside me. Love had always been my offering to him, unconditional and unwavering, but now it was being used as a weapon against me. I excused myself, leaving him at the table while I walked into the restroom. Inside the cold silence of that tiled room, I leaned against the sink and stared at my reflection. Lines carved deeper than before traced across my face. I whispered to myself, almost to test if my voice still worked, asking how I had reached this moment. My son was supposed to be my pride, my legacy. Yet here I stood, staring at a man who felt foolish, small, and betrayed. I splashed water on my face, but it did not cool the burning rage that had begun to form. When I returned, the envelope was gone. My son smiled faintly and said he had already put everything in motion. My chest tightened. He had not asked permission. He had declared fate. That was the moment the betrayal became clear. It was not a mistake or an accident. It was deliberate. He had planned this. He had lured me here under the promise of a surprise, and he had shackled me in plain sight, confident I would never break free. The days that followed were suffocating. Letters arrived. Phone calls buzzed through the night. Collectors spoke in tones that stripped me of dignity. I watched my savings evaporate like morning mist under a roofless sun. But worst of all was the silence from my son. He barely answered my calls, and when he did, it was always brief. He said he was working on fixing it, but the truth was etched in the pauses between his words. He was gone, detached, leaving me alone to choke on the consequences. I walked the streets at night, restless, replaying every memory I had of raising him. The scraped knees I bandaged, the school plays I never missed, the long nights I worked so he could have a chance at a better future. And I wondered when love had transformed into this cruel betrayal. The rage was no longer just a flame. It had become a firestorm building inside me, demanding release. But revenge, I told myself, required patience. To strike too soon would only burn me further. One afternoon, I visited an old friend who knew about finance. I laid the documents before him, my voice hollow. He scanned the papers and shook his head slowly. What my son had done was calculated. My name had been used as collateral. My identity had been forged into contracts I had never seen. The trap was sealed long before that dinner. The envelope had only been the unveiling. My friend asked me if I planned to fight back legally. I told him no. The law could drag for years and still leave me broken. This betrayal was not just about money. It was about blood, and only blood could balance it. The more I investigated, the deeper the rot spread. My son had not fallen into debt. He had orchestrated deals, reckless and greedy, always under the illusion that his father would bail him out. He had gambled not only with money, but with trust, knowing I would never turn away. And now, when the walls closed in, he had forced me to the ground as a cushion for his fall. Each discovery was another nail hammered into the coffin of the father I once was. The man who forgave. The man who endured. That man was dying. What grew in his place was someone colder, sharper, unwilling to bend anymore. I began to plan in silence. Step by step, thought by thought, I carved a path not toward survival, but toward retribution. My son thought he had sealed my fate, but what he had truly done was awaken the one thing he had never expected, my will to fight back, not with weakness, but with fire. And so I watched. I waited. I listened to his excuses, his apologies, his carefully crafted lies. I let him believe I was broken, but inside me, the storm gathered strength. Soon the time would come to reveal that I was no longer the father who simply carried burdens. I was the man who would turn betrayal into the very weapon that destroyed him. The morning the plan began, I woke with a single thought, cutting through the fog of sleepless nights. I would not let him bury me with his debts. I would not let the son I loved use my name as a noose. The house felt emptier than before, but my resolve felt fuller, like a weight I could lift and swing when the moment came. I moved quietly through the rooms, making calls I had been putting off, arranging meetings with people I had once helped and who now remembered me with a respect that warmed my chest. I told one old colleague a partial truth, and he understood without questions, offering resources and advice in curt sentences that brooked no argument. I met a lawyer for coffee and asked blunt questions, not about endless litigation, but about leverage, about exposure, about the quickest route to cut the strings he had tied to my name. The lawyer's face changed as he read the papers I had found, and when he looked up, his voice was low with a sort of weary admiration. "This was not accidental," he said. "This was deliberate. You will need a public stage as much as a legal one." I listened and felt a cold clarity settle in my bones. I began a quiet campaign, invisible to everyone but those who mattered. I called the creditors and asked for proof of claims, not as a supplicant, but as a man with a right to know every detail. I sent stern letters to firms that had accepted my forged name and watched them squirm when audits were mentioned. I met with a disgruntled supplier who had been stiffed by my son and convinced him to put his account into writing, out of spite if nothing else, and he did so with the kind of blunt candor that becomes a weapon in court. I coaxed a notary into admitting small discrepancies by promising him discretion and offering an easy exit from embarrassment. Each recorded conversation, each signed letter, each reluctant confession became another strand in the net I was weaving. I felt the old patience, the steady hand that had gotten me through hard winters, guiding me now. Patience had been my ally for decades, and now it served a new purpose. He continued to play the part of the blameless son for the public, smiling in photos, posting those hollow updates that meant so little when you peeled back the glossy layer. He called infrequently, voice thin and contrite, promising to fix things and asking, not even asking for forgiveness exactly, but for a lifeline. Each time he called, I swallowed the immediate impulse to answer with anger and instead asked questions. "Who are your partners?" I would say quietly. "Show me the contracts. Who guaranteed your loans?" He stumbled in his explanations more and more, the threads of his confidence unraveling one by one. When he offered a plan that involved blaming an obscure consultant I had never heard of, I smiled inwardly because that was the mistake of a cornered man. He reached for scapegoats rather than solutions. The day of the meeting came when I arranged for him to sit with the investor I had secretly solicited to look into his refinancing. I had been careful to invite not the sort of man who would be intimidated by familial grief, but a composed figure with a reputation for cutting through nonsense. We met in a modest conference room, and the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the ordinary smells that make revelations feel all the more mortal. My son arrived in his suit like a man accustomed to applause, but I could see the new tremor at the edges of his smile. He greeted the investor as if buying time with charm, then launched into the polished spiel he had practiced for cameras. The investor watched, asked civil questions, and when the answers were lists of hope, rather than numbers, he asked for specifics. I slid a folder across the table with the copies I had gathered. The journalist I had spoken to earlier was not present physically, but his contact was in my pocket, and his lead was already drafted. The investor read, frowned, and his posture shifted. That evening the investor excused himself politely and asked for time to consider the figures, and my son left the room, holding the conversation like a wounded animal. He texted me later that night with a short message filled with thin threats and false bravado, daring me to make good on my promises. I answered with a single sentence that was neither threat nor plea. I said simply that I had done no more than prepare truth for those willing to look. He replied with a string of profanities, and then silence. Silence is a potent sound. It had become the instrument by which I would measure his unraveling. Word moved faster than I had expected. The journalist I had nudged picked up the scent and called with a tone of professional hunger I had not heard in years. He asked for documents and testimony, and I handed them over without show. The first piece went live quietly on a blog the next morning, a careful unraveling of a pattern that, when seen collectively, was impossible to dismiss as mistake. Comments swelled. Messages arrived in my inbox from strangers who had been hurt by similar schemes, and slowly the story widened like a bruise spreading under skin. My son called in a panic and begged me to stop it, to take down what I had posted. I had not posted anything. I had only passed truth to those who could hold it and present it without the bias that love sometimes brings. When I told him that the papers had already been seen by people with power and patience, his voice broke in a way that set something hard and final in my chest. His world began to fracture. Partners who once toasted his successes now asked for audits. Lawyers who had smiled at his promises grew quiet when confronted with my careful documentation. He called friends, seeking loyalty, and found doors closed with polite firmness. The accounts that once looked like a rising tide showed signs of erosion. He came to me one night desperate, his eyes hollow and raw, and offered terrible bargains, with too many clauses and too few guarantees. He asked me to step in, to sign, to be the father who would save him. I said no. I told him instead that the only way forward was through ownership of his mistakes and repair of the damage he had done. His face went ashen, and he left with a hitching breath like the sound of a man who had fallen out of theater and into real life. There were harder moments. He lost business deals he had thought secure. He received letters from people who wanted what was owed rather than empty promises. He tried to reforge alliances with half-truths and flattery, but men who trade in truth smell falsehood quickly and retreat. The humiliation he had once visited upon me returned to visit his own doorstep, and it arrived with a cruel punctuality that I felt in my ribs like a small, slow drum. I did not dance on his ruin. I measured his steps and kept my distance. This was not catharsis but correction, and correction requires steadiness, not spectacle. Months passed, and the last of the strongmen who had surrounded him fell away like leaves in a late wind. He came to me once more, face hollow but clearer, and sat without demands. He admitted the weight of what he had done. He asked for help in the smallest way, to learn to pay back what he owed honestly and to make good on promises he had broken. I watched his humility like a weathered man watches a rare sunrise. It did not undo the damage, but it was something. I told him I would help under 3 conditions: transparency, restitution, and honesty. He agreed with a voice that trembled and a nod that felt like a surrender. Years later, When the dust had settled and the accounts had been squared through painful work and long sacrifices, I found myself standing in a small room with a younger man who had learned the weight of his choices. He was not the boy who had slid the envelope across the table, but he was not the monster either. He had become a man made small by consequence and remade by effort. We did not speak much about the betrayal anymore. There were some truths that words could not fix, but there was a new rhythm in our exchanges, a careful rebuilding measured in monthly payments and apologies that were less rehearsed and more sincere with every passing day. In the quiet of my life, I learned that revenge need not be cruel to be complete. I had not humiliated him publicly for the sake of a spectacle. I had not sought to break him into shards for my satisfaction. I had used truth, patience, and old alliances to return the debt to its rightful owner and to teach a hard lesson about responsibility. Where his arrogance had once sought to buy him the world, he had now learned to earn even a small corner of it again. On a warm evening, years after the first envelope was opened, he brought me a small envelope of his own. It contained the final receipt of a payment made on time and a short note that read, "Thank you for not letting my lies stand." I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. It was not the grand vindication I might have fantasized about. It was quieter, truer, and more than enough. If this story hit you in the chest and left you wanting justice for wrongs, subscribe now so you never miss another story where truth finds its way back into the light.